Today we're going to be looking at how you can fine-tune and deploy an embedding model using Marqtune and Marqo Cloud. Let's dive straight into it. For this video we're going to be using this blog post as well as this Google Colab notebook here. We're going to primarily stick with the Google Colab notebook because that's where we're going to be running our code, but I'll put the links to both the blog post here and the notebook in the description and the pinned comment so you can run this code alongside as well and read the text if you want some more information as well. Firstly, what are we going to be using to train and deploy our embedding model? So we're going to be using Marqtune, which is available on Marqo Cloud, to perform the fine-tuning. Now, as a bit of a side note, just as it's mentioned here in the notebook, Marqtune itself is made by Marqo, and Marqo built Marqtune on the foundation of their training framework, which is called Generalized Contrastive Learning, or GCL for short. Now, with GCL, you can actually fine-tune embedding models, as it says here, to rank search results not just by semantic relevance, but also by a ranking system that you can define yourself. And so it allows you to get better and more relevant search results that cater to your use case or your business. Now, I'll be putting a link to this paper that we have here, this blog post on GCL, and there's also a paper that goes with it. I'll put them in the description and the pinned comment if you're interested in reading a little bit more about this training framework. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to dive straight into using Marqtune. Now, I mentioned that Marqtune is used to fine-tune the embedding models. Marqo Cloud is what we'll use to deploy the embedding model. And the fantastic thing about both of these is Marqtune is available in Marqo Cloud, and so it basically makes training and deploying embedding models so easy because it's all in one platform. So those are the two tools that we're going to use to fine-tune and deploy. Let's dive straight into the code and start doing so. So the first thing is obviously setup. As with anything, we need to install the relevant libraries, and so we're just going to run this here, and we are just installing Marqtune and then Marqo, and these are the only two packages, Python packages, that we need to install for this demo, which makes things very easy. Now, while this is doing that, I'm just going to move on to the next part, which is collecting your API key. So all of this code here is basically just defining the API key that we're going to need to use Marqtune and Marqo Cloud. And luckily, the API key for both is exactly the same, and you can find that in Marqo Cloud itself. So here we have Marqo Cloud. Now, you just head to cloud.marqo.ai, and obviously I'm already signed in, but you'll be greeted with a sign in or a sign up page. If you've already used Marqo before, then sign in and you'll be greeted with a screen similar to this. If you haven't already signed up to Marqo Cloud, then just click the sign up and follow the steps on the screen, and then you'll be greeted with this wonderful screen here. Now, once you've done all that, you can just head over to your API keys and access your API key here. Now, you can press this here to copy your API key or view your API key, and once you've copied it, you can paste it into, you can either specify here, API key, and then copy your API key into here. But just for safety reasons, what we like to do is define it as a secret in Google Colab. And so you'll just head to your secrets here and copy your API key into a variable called Marqo API key, which is what we've done here. So once you've done that and got your API key and you have defined it here, we can then set up our Marqtune client, and this is what's going to allow us to do all of the fine tuning. So let's run this and store our API key, and then we'll set up the Marqtune client. Fantastic. Now, obviously we're going to be performing fine tuning, so we need to get a data set for this, and this is what this next section does. So we're going to be using a subset of the Marqo Google Shopping 10 million dataset. This specific example that we're using in this video is for e-commerce, but you can use it for a variety of different use cases as well. But we're going to be taking a subset of this dataset, which I'll just show you on Hugging Face. All of the models that Marqo have developed, so their e-commerce and fashion state-of-the-art embedding models, are all available to access freely on their Hugging Face, as well as a variety of different training and evaluation datasets as well, including the Marqo Google Shopping 10 million dataset, which we have on here. Now, this is kind of an idea of what it's going to look like. We've got a variety of different e-commerce items, and in the notebook, I actually show you a tiny few lines of the dataset here. So the dataset itself entails a query, a title, an image, and a score. Now, the score value here, we're not going to include that in our fine-tuning, because this is just a general fine-tuning script. We're just going to show you how you can do a general fine-tune and deploy it using Marqo Cloud. But if you are interested and you do have a data set that entails score metrics, then you can also fine-tune on the score value as well. We have an entire article dedicated to that. So if you're interested, then join the Slack community or reach out to us on social media and we can send that your way. So that is the data set. As you can see, we've got things like easy cleaning detachable kitchen scissors, our titles here, and then a link to the image itself and a score value. So that's what the dataset looks like. What we'll do now is we will download this CSV file to our drive and then open it and make sure we can access it. And so we just click run here, just check I've run everything before, yep, and it's downloaded it to our drive. Perfect. So now we can use this dataset and we can load this into Marqtune ready to perform fine-tuning. Now, before we do that, we need to define what is known as a data schema in Marqtune. And the idea behind this is we want to identify the columns that we see in the CSV and ensure that they get uploaded to a Marqtune dataset as well. Like I mentioned, we're just going to be using query, title, and image, those columns for this video, but you can also use a score metric as well. So we define these in our data schema. We're saying we've got a query, a title, and an image, and then we just explain what they are. So query and title are obviously text, and the image here, because it's a URL here, it's an image pointer. And so you must define this data schema before you then create a data set in Marqtune. So we'll just define that. So creating a training data set in Marqtune is really, really simple. It's just this bit of code here. We basically just say, okay, Marqtune client, which we've already defined, we want to create a data set. The data set name itself is going to be whatever we define. So here we've written our training data, which we've defined up here as gs_100,000 training.csv. And before I forgot to mention, we're taking 100,000 subset of the Marqo GS 10 million dataset. So we've got 100,000 entries in this dataset that we're going to be fine-tuning, that we're going to be using to fine-tune. Then we just mention, okay, where is this coming from? So we define the file path, the dataset type itself. So this dataset type here is for training purposes, but you can have evaluation dataset as well. We omit this from this video, but if you're interested, then there are follow-up articles that you can also see on how to create evaluation datasets as well. Now we define our data schema, our query columns and result columns, and we wait for completion to be true. And it's as simple as that. We just click run, and this will now start creating a dataset in Marqtune. So let's have a look at what this does in Marqo Cloud itself. So if we head over to Marqo Cloud, you'll see we have a Marqtune section here. And if you click on Marqtune, what you'll now notice is this has populated. Before we had empty rows in here, and now this has started populating. And that's because our dataset, as we defined here, is being created. And so when we click on this, we can see some of the logs, or the logs will start to populate as we add more data to our dataset. Fantastic. Our dataset has just been created. If we head back over to Marqtune and we click refresh, we'll see that our dataset is indeed ready. The status of it is ready. And if we click on the dataset itself, we can see information about the column headers. So they're here, and data types here, and a little bit more about the dataset ID, for example, and the logs here as well. Fantastic. Now, we can obviously see the same logs in the notebook itself, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to hide this output just so we can see the code a little bit better. So our dataset has been created, and now we can use this dataset to perform fine-tuning. Now, this section here in the notebook is basically just saying what you can expect to see in Marqo Cloud, but we've already seen that here. Now, let's go back to Marqtune. And we've created a data set. Now what we want to do is create a model, and that's what we're going to do now. So we want to fine-tune an embedding model. Now in this section, we're going to be fine-tuning this pre-trained model here, and I'll just open this in a separate tab. And this is the model that we're going to fine-tune. Something to mention here is you can fine-tune any model that you want. Just make sure you check the Marqtune documentation to make sure that that model is supported in Marqtune for fine-tuning. So this is the model that we're going to be using to fine-tune on, a clip VIT B32 model. And now we're going to first specify some hyperparameters, so training hyperparameters, and then perform the training itself. So here we have the training hyperparameters. We have chosen a pretty minimal set of training hyperparameters here, and that's just to get you started quickly. So here we've mainly said about the left and right keys, which we can see here are the left keys we're going to use query and weight of 1, and then the right keys are the image title and the weights as 0.9 and 0.1. So we're weighting the image more heavily than the title. And we're just going to perform this training for 5 epochs. And you can specify as little as that many training parameters to get you performing a fine-tuning. Great. Now we specify what base model we're using, so VIT B32, and what checkpoint it's going to be, which is this one here. And then this section here basically explains how you can perform fine-tuning with Marqtune. And so we use the Marqtune client, we specify that we want to train a model, we explain what dataset we want to be using, so what training dataset we want to use to perform the fine-tuning, and here it says training dataset, dataset ID, and we've already defined what our training dataset was here. Here it is. So we're going to be using the dataset that we've just created in Marqtune. Fantastic. Next, we're going to specify the model name, and we've just defined that here, so this can be anything you want. Here we're just basically saying it's the training data plus a model on the end. Now the instance type here is basic, but if you want to utilize more powerful hardware, then you can use the performance instance type here. So put performance here instead of basic, and then we explain what base model we're going to be using, which are these here. We define our hyperparameters, which obviously we've defined here already, and again we wait for completion to be true. And then all we have to do is click run, and this will train a new model on the dataset that we've just defined, and your terminal output will look very similar to this here. Obviously it won't look exactly the same because this is a different date and a different time, but it will look very similar. And so while this fine-tuning is happening, it's going to fine-tune for 5 epochs like we've mentioned here, and you'll see the logs begin to populate in here and also in Marqtune as well. So if we refresh Marqo Cloud on the Marqtune section, you can see here that we are creating a model. If we click on it, there may not be many logs. Oh, we're getting a couple of logs, and these logs will continue to populate in here the more the fine-tuning proceeds with its tasks. And so what you'll find is you'll see very similar information, like I said here, about the training epoch with lots of different information about logit scales, bias, losses, weight, mean loss, and overall loss as well. And so you can expect this to populate 5 different times because we're training for 5 epochs. And so I will come back to you once the fine-tuning has been completed. Okay, fantastic. Our model has been fine-tuned, and we can see this in the logs here. So this was the code that we just ran, and we can see in the logs that we've trained for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 epochs. We can see information about the training through each epoch here, as we can see. And finally it says model creation has been completed and gives us the model ID here. So if we head over to Marqo Cloud and head to Marqtune, we should see our model, and indeed we do, it's here. So this is our new model, and logs here are all the logs that we've just seen, so all of the fine-tuning information. Fantastic. Now we'll head back to the notebook, and this section is explaining what you're expecting to see in Marqo Cloud. Obviously we've just seen that, so that's great. Indeed, we have a new model in our Marqo Cloud platform. Now, if we want to deploy this fine-tuned model using Marqo Cloud, what we need to do is we need to release one of the epochs. So we need to release the checkpoints. And we can either do that through code. So this code here basically says, let's take the model that we've just fine-tuned and we want to release epoch 5. So let's say you're fine-tuning and you find that epoch 5 is the best version of the model. Let's say the loss is the lowest, and you say, okay, that's what I want to use to then deploy this for a search application using Marqo Cloud. To release it, you can run this code, which will release it, and we'll do this. Click run, and it's released the model. And if I head back to Cloud and I refresh, we'll see that when we click back onto our model, epoch 5 has been released. Now you can do it that way through code, but you can also just click release here and it'll release it. So for example, I say epoch 3 was actually the best checkpoint. If I click release, it comes up with this information here, and you say, yes, I want to release it, and then it'll release that for you. So you can either do it through Marqo Cloud itself or through code. And that's the same for all the other things as well. You know, you can create a data set in Marqo Cloud, you can train a model in Marqo Cloud, but for the purpose of this video, we're showing you how you can do it through code. Perfect, this is the model that we will then deploy on Marqo Cloud. So that is fine-tuning with Marqtune. It really is as simple as that. If you're interested in how you can evaluate this, we have blog posts on our website. I'll put them in the description and the pinned comment if you're interested in learning a little bit more about other stuff that you can do with Marqtune and the documentation as well. But now we're ready to deploy our model, our trained model on Marqo Cloud. And we'll look at how you can do that. So as we did with the Marqtune client, we need to initialize the Marqo client. And to do that, very, very similar. We use the same API key. So if we click run for this, it's just going to initialize the Marqo client. Really, really simple. The next thing we want to do is create an index. And that's where we're going to add all of our documents to. And this is what we're going to use to perform searches. And when we create this index, the embedding model that we want to use is obviously the one that we've just fine-tuned. And this is basically, this code here is defining this. So we say the model ID that we want to use as part of our index, so what model we want to specify when we create our index, is going to be the one that we've just created. Now it's important to note that here, the code that you're going to write to ensure that you use the model that you've just fine-tuned, it's going to be Marqtune / the model ID of the tune model, so we can see that here, so that's the fine-tuned model, / the checkpoint that you have released. Now it's important to note that this has to be released for this to work, otherwise you'll come across errors. And that's just what this section is saying here. So for more information, just pause the video and read this here. So we define our settings. We're basically saying that we want an unstructured index. This is going to be the model, the fine-tuned model that we've just fine-tuned. We're going to treat URL and pointers as images, and that just is basically allowing the image URLs that we have in our dataset to be configured correctly. And the inference type that we're going to use is marqo.cpu.large. You can use GPU here if you want faster inference. Now the index name we're going to define as e-commerce search, because like I said, the dataset that we've used to fine-tune is specifically for e-commerce, and so it makes sense to use a model that we fine-tuned for a specific domain to search over products in that domain. So we're going to be using e-commerce search. Now the next step is to create the index. Really, really simple. Just connect to the Marqo client, create the index with the index name that we've defined here and with our settings. And if we click run, this will now create an index in Marqo Cloud. So if we head to Marqo Cloud, head to indexes, what you'll notice when I refresh the page is this index is now being created. And we can see that here, it says about 5 minutes remaining. And if we click on this, we can see some basic information about the index name, the inference pods, shards. Fantastic. I will come back once this index has been successfully created in Marqo Cloud, and then we'll look at how you can add documents to your index and then perform searches. So our index is now ready. You can see that we've been creating this, and it says that index achieved status ready successfully. So if we head back over to Marqo Cloud, we can see that the index that we named e-commerce search is indeed ready, which means we can now add documents to it and perform searches, which is great. So we've done that. I'm just going to hide the output of the terminal here just so we can see the code. So we created our index. Now we're going to add documents to this index. Now for the purpose of this video, we're going to be using the same data set that we used for our training data set. So we already have the path to this data, and that's because we've already downloaded it. And the documents within this data set are what we're going to be adding to our index. And so we can run this. We can basically create a pandas data frame, which we see here. And then we're going to write the documents in a format that Marqo Cloud likes. So we run this. And the very next thing to do is add documents to our index. And we're going to be doing that in batch sizes. Now, for the purpose of this video, you can iterate through and go through all 100,000 entries and add all of those to your index. It's worth mentioning that even when you're adding documents to your index, you can still perform searches. So you can create a separate Google Colab notebook. You can have one that's adding all of the documents to your index, and you can have a separate one to perform searches. For the purpose of this video, just to make things easier, we're keeping it all in one notebook. And so we're just going to add 124 documents to our index and then perform a search. So that's what this section does here. We're basically adding documents to our index. Now we're going to add the batch. So the batch size is 64. So we're going to add a batch of 64 documents initially. We're going to loop through and add batch by batch. Obviously here we say that the client batch size is 64. And here we are defining our mappings for when we add documents to our index. And the reason for this is because we want to weight, let's say the image URL here, we want to weight that more heavily when we're creating our tensors and our vectors compared to the query and title. And that's because a query may not describe everything that we see in an image, likewise with a title. And so if we weight our image URLs more heavily, then the embedding model can pick up nuances within that image. And finally, we specify the fields that we want for the vector generation, which is this image title multimodal here, which is a multimodal combination, including the weights of each of our fields in here, which is great. And if we click run, this will now add documents to our index. And while they are being added, we can perform searches. Obviously, for the purpose of this video, we'll wait for the 124 documents to be added, just so we can move on to the next cell. Fantastic, there we go. Our documents have been added. Now, this next bit is something that I quite like to do, and it's just getting the statistics of our index. You don't have to do it, it's just something that I quite like to do when adding documents. And when you run it, you can basically see the number of documents that you've got in your index. You can also see number of vectors and so on and so forth. But if you go back to Marqo Cloud and you refresh your index, you will see the documents have been added and these will become populated here. So 128 documents and 128 vector count and some extra index stats as well. So I quite like to do that just so I can keep track of, how many documents are in my index. Now, the very final thing that we want to do is search over this index. I've created a function here, which to search in Marqo, it's literally just one line of code. Let me just find that line of code right here. So searching in Marqo is really, really simple. I've just added some extra code into here to basically display the image that is the top result and also add weighting in there as well. So if someone wants to specify more of something or less of something in a query, then Marqo can handle that as well. And so the more of or less of is what we can see here. And this here is just displaying the image. So click run for this. That's great. Now we can perform a simple search. So for the purpose of this video, we only have 124 documents in our index. And so the more of and less of may not work as well. If you add the entire 100,000 entries in your dataset to the index, then obviously more of and less of will work better. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to query just a top and leave the other two fields blank. And again, when you run this, it gives you the top image URL, which is here, and it does indeed display a top. And that was exactly what our query was. Now, as a bit of housekeeping, if you want to clean up your index, basically you will be charged for an index when you create it. And if you don't delete your index, you'll continue to be charged for it. So this section here, one line of code, just delete your index when you no longer want to use it. And we can click run, and this will start deleting our index. And I'll just show you what the terminal output is here. There we go. So we can see that the index itself is being deleted. If I head back over to indexes in Marqo Cloud, we can see that the index is indeed being deleted. And that is exactly how you can fine-tune and deploy an embedding model using both Marqtune and Marqo Cloud. It is incredibly simple and incredibly easy to set up. If you have any questions at all, then join our Slack community where a member of our team is more than happy to help. And if you want to book a demo and see how Marqo and Marqtune can be used in your business, then I'll put a link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.